Ever been out fishing at night and get that feeling like something's watching you?
You're trying to scare me already.
Maybe just a little. But on a serious note, tonight we're diving into a case that just might make you think twice about those late-night fishing trips. It's the Pascagoula Abduction, one of the most famous alleged alien encounters.
Oh yeah, Pascagoula. A
Mhm.
classic one that has it all. Strange lights, a mysterious craft, and being straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right. And it all happened back in 1973 on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Two shipyard workers, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, were just enjoying some afterwork fishing when things got really weird.
It wasn't just a glimpse of a UFO either. They claimed they were actually taken aboard.
They were. And the descriptions of what they went through on that craft, that's what really makes this case stand out. Let's set the scene. It was dusk Cable Elena. Hickson and Parker were fishing from an old pier when they heard this strange whirring sound.
And then they saw it. A blue light hovering over the water. Then this oval-shaped craft, about 30 to 40 feet long, just appeared out of nowhere and came down towards them.
Imagine that. You're just fishing, minding your own business, and suddenly you've got a UFO right there. Can you picture how terrified they must have been?
Absolutely. Especially when three beings came out of the craft. And we're not talking your typical little green men here.
Not even close. Hickson and Parker said they had gray, wrinkled skin, no necks, and crab-like claws. Just thinking about it gives me chills.
And to make things even worse, the men said they were suddenly paralyzed. Couldn't move, couldn't speak.
So they're stuck there, helpless, watching these bizarre beings come towards them. Sounds like a nightmare.
It does. According to their accounts, the beings lifted them into the craft, just floated them right up. Inside, they were separated and subjected to what they describe as a medical examination.
Wait, a medical exam? Like these
Hmm.
crab-like creatures were checking their blood pressure?
Not quite. Hickson described a large metallic eye-like object scanning him from head to toe. Parker, on the other hand, said he was examined by something more humanoid, a female with long fingers and big eyes.
A female alien. Now that's a twist you don't hear every day in these abduction stories.
Pretty unique. And she apparently used these long, thin probes that came out of her fingers to examine his throat and nasal cavity.
Okay, now that's creepy. I'm starting to get why they were so freaked out. So what happened after this exam? Did they just drop him back on the pier and say, see you later?
Pretty much. They were suddenly back on the pier just as fast as they were taken. The craft vanished. The whole thing was over in about 20 minutes.
I bet those 20 minutes felt like a lifetime for Hickson and Parker. You know what gets me is that even after all that, they went straight to the police.
I know, right? And as you can imagine, the police were skeptical at first. Two guys talking about crab-like aliens and floating medical exams. Sounds like a prank, right?
Totally. But here's where it gets interesting. The officers left Hickson and Parker alone in a room, thinking they'd confess to making it all up. Little did they know they were secretly recording everything.
Oh man, that's juicy. What did the recording show?
Well, let's just say it didn't sound like a hoax. They were genuinely terrified. You can hear the fear and confusion in their voices. They were worried about their families, worried about what had happened to them, and they sounded completely bewildered by the whole thing.
So even the police started to take them seriously.
They did enough to give them both lie detector tests. And guess what? They both passed.
Wow. That's pretty convincing, but of course there are always skeptics, right? What did the naysayers have to say about it?
Well, some suggested it was a hypnagogic hallucination.
You mean that vivid, dreamlike state when you're falling asleep or waking up? You might see or hear things that aren't real.
Right. Others thought maybe it was sleep paralysis, which can cause feelings of terror and hallucinations.
Yeah.
But wouldn't a shared hallucination like that be super rare? Especially one with such specific and consistent details.
Good point. And there's another thing. There are actually multiple reports of strange lights in the sky that night matching Hickson and Parker's description.
So it wasn't just them seeing things. That adds some credibility to their story. You know what's interesting is that even Philip J. Klass, a well-known UFO skeptic, acknowledged the men's genuine fear and the fact they passed multiple lie detector tests.
But even with all that, he wasn't totally convinced. He suggested Hickson might have been embellishing the story over time.
Well, I guess even with the evidence, it comes down to belief, doesn't it? You have to
Yeah.
admit the details are pretty compelling.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so much more to this story.
There is. Like, what exactly did they say happened to them inside that craft?
Oh, you're not going to believe this. But each of them had a very different, and let's just say unusual experience.
Oh, you got me hooked.
Each of them had a very different experience inside the craft.
Really? Like what?
Okay, so try to imagine you're in their shoes. You've just been floated aboard this strange craft, and you have no clue what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think at that point I'd be begging to go back to the riverbank, even with those creepy crab-like creatures around.
Right. But no escape for them. Now, here's where things get even weirder. Hickson and Parker said they had completely different experiences inside.
How so?
Well, Hickson said he was surrounded by three of those crab-like beings.
Those things sound terrifying. What did they do to him?
He said they used their claws to examine his body like they were probing him or something.
Ouch. Not sure any doctor's checkup could be weirder than that.
Right. And get this, Hickson said he felt this big metallic thing scanning him, moving up and down his body and all around his head.
Whoa! Like some kind of futuristic X-ray machine. Makes you wonder what they were looking for.
That's the big question, isn't it? And while Hickson was dealing with those crab-like beings, Parker said something totally different happened to him.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What happened to Parker?
Remember how he mentioned a female being?
Yeah, the one with the long fingers? That was pretty strange for an abduction story.
Right. Well, according to Parker, she was the one who examined him inside.
Wait, so he was examined by a female alien. That's not something you hear every day?
Definitely not your typical alien encounter. Parker said she looked more human with delicate features and big almond-shaped eyes.
Interesting. So not as monstrous as those crab-like things Hickson described.
Not at all. But don't be fooled by her looks. Parker said he was terrified.
I bet. What did she do to him?
He says she pressed on different parts of his body and then she used those long, thin probes that came out of her fingers to check his throat and nasal cavity.
Oh man, that's disturbing. Sounds like a scene from a sci-fi horror film.
I know, right? One of the creepier details of this whole case.
So Hickson's being examined by crab-like creatures, and Parker's being probed by a female alien. It's like they were on two different ships.
That's what's so interesting about their stories. Some skeptics think this difference proves they made the whole thing up.
Well, like, how could two people who went through the same thing tell such different stories?
Right. But others say those differences actually make the case more believable.
How so?
Well, if they were making it all up, wouldn't they have come up with a story that made more sense?
That's a good point. The different stories almost make it seem less likely they were lying.
Right. It suggests they weren't just trying to get attention. Did they say anything about the craft itself?
Yeah, they both described a round room filled with this harsh white light that seemed to be coming from the walls.
Interesting. That seems to come up a lot in abduction stories.
Right, like it's some standard design feature in alien spaceships.
Maybe. They also mentioned consoles with blinking lights and holographic symbols that look like hieroglyphics.
So like a futuristic control room.
Exactly. And they said these symbols were moving and changing shape as the aliens worked.
Wild. Sounds straight out of Star Trek.
You got it. And get this, they both said the craft didn't just feel like a machine, it felt alive.
Alive. Like it had a mind of its own.
That's what they said. They described it as being sentient and aware of them like it was a living organism.
Wow, that's even weirder.
It is, and if things weren't strange enough, they mentioned this bizarre, rhythmic buzzing sound that was so disorienting they almost threw up.
Okay, I'm starting to feel queasy just hearing about it.
It's definitely one of the more intense parts of their story. It's interesting how many people who claim to have been abducted report similar things, you know?
Yeah, like the bright lights,
Yeah.
strange sounds, and the feeling of being examined.
It really makes you wonder if there's something connecting all these experiences, whatever they might be.
It's a mystery, that's for sure. So after all this, the examination, the buzzing sounds, the weird lights, how did it end?
Well, they said they were suddenly back on the pier just as abruptly as they were taken.
Just like that, poof, back to reality.
Exactly. And they were dazed and confused, thinking hours had passed.
But you said it was only about 20 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
That distorted sense of time. It's another classic thing in abduction stories.
So they go through this insane experience, get dumped back on the pier, and only 20 minutes have gone by. What do they do?
Went straight to the police, remember? And even though there was no physical evidence, the cops were intrigued enough by their story and how genuinely scared they were that they took them seriously.
Especially after they passed those lie detector tests.
Right. But even though their case got a lot of attention, neither Hickson nor Parker ever wanted to go back to that spot.
I don't blame them. Who'd want to go back to a place where something so weird and scary happened?
You got it. But here's the thing, this event really stuck with both of them, especially Calvin Parker. He ended up in the hospital multiple times in the years after the abduction.
That's sad. It shows how much this experience messed with him, even if you don't believe it literally happened.
For sure. And it makes you think about the psychological effects of these supposed encounters, whether they're real or not.
So true. It's not just about spaceships and aliens. It's about the real people who say they've had these experiences and the trauma they might be carrying.
Well said. Now let's switch gears for a bit and talk about the bigger picture of the Pascagoula abduction.
Okay, I'm ready for a history lesson.
Great. So let's go back to 1973. It was a crazy time for ufology, right in the middle of the golden age of UFO sightings.
Hold on, what exactly is ufology? I'm not sure I know all the alien lingo.
It's just the study of unidentified flying objects. Basically, people who investigate UFO sightings and try to figure out what's really going on.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. So back to 1973. Why was it the golden age for UFOs?
Well, public interest in UFOs was huge, fueled by a bunch of famous cases, and of course, sci-fi movies about aliens were getting really popular.
So aliens were all the rage back then.
You could say that. And the Pascagoula abduction happened right in the middle of all this. Was it unique, though, or were there other similar cases happening?
That's a great question. What do you think?
Well, while the Pascagoula case is pretty unusual, especially those crab-like beings, there were other abduction cases being reported around the same time, and some had some striking similarities.
Like what?
For example, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction in 1961. They also had a late-night encounter with strange lights missing time, and later under hypnosis, they remembered being taken aboard a craft and examined by beings with big eyes.
So alien abductions and medical exams weren't a new idea.
Not at all. And it makes you wonder how these earlier cases might have influenced how people saw the Pascagoula abduction.
You mean, did those earlier stories affect how people interpreted what happened to Hickson and Parker?
Exactly. The Hill case got a ton of attention, and it introduced those ideas of missing time and alien medical exams to the public.
So it's like a cultural story was building around these experiences.
Right. And the Pascagoula abduction, with its vivid details and multiple witnesses, added to this growing collection of abduction stories.
It's fascinating how these stories can shape our understanding of what an alien abduction might be like.
It is. It's like we're all creating a myth together about these encounters.
And the Pascagoula case, with its two witnesses, the secret recording and the multiple reports of strange lights, became a big part of that myth.
Absolutely. It was a case that even the skeptics had a hard time completely dismissing.
It makes you wonder if something really strange did happen that night on the Pascagoula River. What was it?
That's the question that keeps this case alive. That's the question that keeps this case alive. But, we've talked about the details, the witnesses, the evidence, even the psychological impact.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is what happened after Pascagoula,
Right. Like, how did this one thing in Mississippi change how we think about UFOs and alien abductions?
Good question. I think there are a few key reasons.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one, Pascagoula became like a landmark case.
Landmark. What do you mean?
I mean, it's one of the cases people always talk about as being really well documented and credible,
More credible than other cases.
That's up for debate, for sure, but it definitely captured people's imaginations in a way that most cases don't.
I can see why. It's got everything a good story needs. Strange lights, a mysterious craft, strange creatures, two normal guys caught up in something totally crazy.
Exactly, and it wasn't just the story itself, it was how it all went down.
What do you mean?
We had two witnesses who backed each other up.
Hickson and Parker telling the same story, basically.
And then there's that recording where you can hear how truly scared they were.
Oh yeah, that was a big deal.
Plus, multiple people seeing weird lights in the sky that night.
And those lie detector tests that they aced.
All that together made it really hard for the skeptics to just write it off.
So it wasn't just some silly UFO sighting.
Nope. It really changed how we study UFOs.
Like it made it okay to study UFOs and alien abductions.
Totally. It moved the conversation away from the fringe and got serious researchers interested.
Did it change how UFO investigations were done?
It didn't change everything overnight, but it definitely made people realize that we need to investigate these things more carefully.
So pay more attention to detail, do better interviews, maybe not rely so much on iffy eyewitness accounts.
Exactly. The Pascagoula case showed how complicated these encounters can be and how important it is to gather evidence and analyze it carefully.
And I bet it also showed how important it is to think about the mental state of the witnesses.
Absolutely. Especially when there could be trauma involved, like in Pascagoula.
Their experience really showed how much these things can affect people, whether you believe it happened or not.
It reminds us that we're not just dealing with stories, we're dealing with real people and real emotions.
That's true. I'm curious about how the Pascagoula case affected pop culture.
Oh, that's interesting to think about. I'd say it had a pretty big impact.
Did it directly inspire any movies or TV shows?
Hard to say for sure, but the case was so famous that those crab-like creatures definitely probably made it into some writers' and filmmakers' heads.
I can definitely see that. Those things were hard to forget.
Right. And even beyond specific images, the case contributed to this growing fascination with alien abductions in movies and TV.
It became part of how we understand these things.
Totally. And
Okay.
it gave us a framework for tons of stories fueling our imaginations and maybe even our fears.
It's wild to think that one thing can have such a big impact, reaching way beyond the people who were actually there.
It really shows the power of a good story, especially one that taps into our deepest fears and fascinations.
So when we look back at Pascagoula, it's not just about what may or may not have happened that night.
It's about how that event changed how we see the unknown.
It made us think about the possibility that we're not alone in the universe, even if it's just a tiny chance.
And that some of those encounters might be way more personal and scary than we thought.
That's a bit unsettling,
It is. But it also reminds us that there are still so many mysteries out there.
and that it's important to keep an open mind even when things seem impossible.
Exactly. So as we finish up our deep dive into the Pascagoula abduction, we leave you with this.
What if Hickson and Parker were telling the truth? What if something really did happen to them that night on the Pascagoula River?
We may never know for sure.
But the possibility, even if it's a small one, keeps fascinating and inspiring us.
And that's what Forbidden Unveiled is all about, exploring the mysteries, considering the possibilities, and keeping the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the unknown.
Don't forget to follow or subscribe to Forbidden Unveiled for more explorations of the paranormal.
And until next time, keep looking up.